My name is Carl Quo, and this is Founder Quest, a podcast about the journeys of starting a game studio. Stephen MacDonald, founder of Magic Potion Games, is my first guest who's self-described as a serial entrepreneur. He's done 2 prior startups, pushing hard along those journeys, and in between has worked at places like Disney, EA, and Relic. Each startup brought with it new lessons and experiences, which Stephen was quite introspective about, and thoughtful about how he's carried forward those lessons on his journey. It's really inspiring to hear someone who has that level of thoughtfulness really break down each of those prior journeys and how it's shaping their current one. And I think it's a great lesson for anyone who's thinking about the founding journey to learn from and to grow from of how to apply all your previous experiences to your new one. Let's jump in. All right, so the way I always like to start out is if we go back to the start of your founding journey, there was a moment, right, that you're like, yep, I'm starting a company. I'm mentally and emotionally committing to this founding journey. And I'm always curious what led up to that moment and pushed you over.
Yeah. So this is actually my 3rd company I've done. And I think I'm kind of a wannabe serial entrepreneur that keeps on jumping back into the corporate world. But it's really a few things that did it for me this time. So I was working at EA. I was working, I think I've told you the story, Carl, before, but working with Alex Seropian, we were doing a bunch of cool stuff at EA, and EA changed directions, and which is completely understandable. I think we were all bummed because we all had a lot of fun working on that product, and we loved working for the company and everything. But there was a take a deep breath. We were all so invested in the product. Like, give yourself a moment to think of what's next. But I had jumped into another gig really too fast afterwards, and I at this point in my life, I had given myself enough grace that I was very aware that it was a bad fit very early, and just to leave gracefully as I possibly could. So still a huge fan of the company, but I think I lasted like 3 weeks. I think it was my first week. I was like, oh, this isn't a great fit for me. So I'm going to bow out nicely. So I did that. And then I ended up talking to a lot of friends of mine, and there's just a space I've wanted to get back into for a long time in the kids entertainment spot, and I so deeply care about all of it. I was like, well, now's the time. My company, this is the 2nd time I've tried to do this exact same thing, and the stars just aligned so much easier this time. Like sometimes you got to push against obstacles that feel like that's just the cost of entry, and you got to push against it, and it's going to be really hard. And then other times it's just immovable. So the last time I did it, it felt like it was immovable. This time things lined up pretty well. So I think it all kind of clicked and it came together in order. Not to say it was all easy, but it much more doable.
Yeah. When you think about, each of the times you've started a studio, right, and then like committed to that path, what do you feel about that? Like each time, like how has it been different? Like when you think about what led up to pushing you over into committing that first time versus the second time versus now, like how has that sort of that conversation and that changed as it went? Because like so many people, this is a preview, and if you've listened to episodes before, you know that I ask an entirely unfair question at the end, which is like, would you start another studio? And I haven't had a ton of like true serial entrepreneurs, either by mindset or by experience on. And so part of what I'm curious, both by asking that question, but also as you reflect on the others, is like, the first time, is always a whole jumping off point and jumping into a deep end that you didn't really know what you were committing to, and then you learn about it. But every time after that, there's some amount of like, okay, you probably learned some lessons along the way, and you're still doing this. And so, what has been the difference in each of those jumps?
Yeah, and that's a really good question for sure. I mean, the first time, to be honest, was ignorance, right? Is the idea that some friends and I looked at an opportunity and we were just seasoned enough in our careers that we knew we could build something together for sure. Um, and at the time, mobile games had just started and Facebook games had just started, and we were like, "Hey, I bet you we could do that." So we looked at it and went, well, what if we took something that we know is going to be successful and we just did like a prettier version of it and we put our like love and shine on it and we'll jump in together and do it in like record time. So that's what we did. And of course we didn't know anything. So if you don't know, like there's a very big difference between ignorance and bravery, but often they achieve the same result. So, and the difference really is ignorance is I didn't know there was a tiger in the jungle and I walked through the jungle safely. Bravery is knowing the tiger is there and still choosing to walk through it. So, I think ignorance is what got me through the first time. Not that it was very successful, I will say, for sure, but it got me there. I think the thing that kept me coming back again was the idea of it's quite empowering if you feel like you've got something, you have something to give to the world, and you're like, hey, my only way to really do this is to jump, like to just commit, take a chance on myself and my friends, and we're gonna see what happens. I think that's the thing that keeps leading me through that entertainment like games is a hit driven industry, and you can be like right and smart and hardworking and all the things, but there's still all of this like luck and timing involved and success in it. And it's not like other businesses where you're like, wow, like we got a little bit of revenue, but this is how we're going to translate this. It's kind of like, what have you done lately? How relevant are you, and how big is your audience? And you're like, oh wow, that's crazy risky. Um, and that's also intoxicating, like it's just like, I bet you I could do it, and it's
Mhm.
I think that's the thing that kind of keeps me coming back to it over and over. As like I'll go, I'm very I will say enticed by opportunity where it's like, hey, I see something over here evolving, and I think I could really contribute, and I see some other people that I know and trust, and I want to work with them, and we can go jump on something, we'll do something. um, I think I just follow that. I'm like I lead and follow with my heart. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
That's how I feel.
Yeah, I think there's also something about when you see that opportunity and you don't see someone else jumping on it, right? And you're like, why is no one else seeing this? Oh, I better jump on it before anyone else sees it. Like, let's go,
Absolutely.
right? And that's definitely kept me. Uh, I mean, I'm only on my second, so it keeps me coming back as a little bit of a weird statement on. We're not quite at a trend line yet, but it is one of those things where it's like the reasons I jumped for both of mine were, hey, I see this opportunity, I don't see anyone else going for it, and so instead of going and working on a problem I'm not fascinated by, let's go start the thing so I can work on the problem I am fascinated by, right? When you think about, like, especially on this third time, right? Like, you've been through a whole founding journey a couple of times. You've I'm sure had to learn a bunch about business and fundraising, all stuff that you had it didn't necessarily know when you were just a seasoned developer. Um, but on this third go round, what were the things this time that you're like, okay, I've committed to this journey and now I need to go learn X, Y, and Z, right? Like I still don't know this, or now it's different and I need to learn something new. What were those things that felt like you really had to double down on learning once you had committed to the path?
Yeah, that's I think really obvious for me because both times I had done this before were bootstrapped companies and VCs weren't really active in the gaming space at all. So VCs really picked up in the last few years where it's like, hey, I've seen a bunch of people going and pitching companies for VC sized opportunities. And I had no real exposure or um, uh, examples really that I could pull from to know what that looked like. And if you were going to go pitch a game company, this was kind of one of the sources, right? Like you could go try to get some sort of a publishing deal from somebody, pull on a couple of strings like that, um, maybe get some non dilutive, awesome opportunity that aligned with what you wanted to do. Or the other category was, do you have some big dream that you really feel like you could sell? um, that was much more up my alley. So I was like, oh, interesting. I want to know more about this pitching the VC world and what that looks like. And I had many years pitching executives, at bigger companies. So I was used to being in those rooms and kind of selling big vision of what it was and project plans, schedules, and budgets, and all of the things like that. So I thought that was probably a one for one translation, and it turned out not to be. Um, I couldn't actually believe how different it really was. So I got a couple of one of my advisors that I work with. He's very big in the VC world and just had a lot of exposure to what good looked like. And so I started running him through my bigger pitch, and he gave me just a ton of feedback. Just telling me what a pre-read looked like, how big that first deck should be, how to send out those materials, how to book those first pitches. One of the big things that was really helpful that I'm so glad he told me was building a giant Excel sheet with all of the VCs that I was going to reach out to, all of their contacts, and then stack rank it from I don't care at all about this VC all the way up to this is my most important one, the VC that I'm really hoping buys into my vision. So I probably went through, I'd say, 20 to 30 different pitches, getting to know the VC questions with a bunch of VCs that I just didn't care if it landed or not. And then I was able to hone that pitch so much, and I fielded every question possible. By the time I did get to my VCs, that I was like, oh, these are the ones that I'm really hoping are aligned with my company values and I would like to do business with. It was so honed at that point. There was nothing new that anybody had asked me, and I had a like pre-tailored, very rehearsed ways to answer all of the big questions. So I think that was the biggest learning for sure that when I started.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how different each of the functionally potentially different sources of money that you could do this from are from a like pitching and talking to standpoint, right? Like how you talk to a publisher is similar but still different than how you talk to an executive at an established company, right? And that's different than how you talk to more strategic investor, and that's different than how you talk to like angels or sort of like friends and family who you might raise from, and then all of that is still different from how you talk to VCs. um, and so it's definitely a big learning path. Um, when you think about sort of your three founding journeys and both what you've doubled down on learning this time and what you sort of went through the trials by fire prior, um, part of our audience is the folks who are like at that point where they are either about to emotionally commit or they just have. They're like, okay, I'm going to go do this founding thing. What is the biggest sort of learning or advice that you would give person at that decision point, um, from all of your experience?
I would say it's a weird spot to be in because what you're trying to do is hype yourself to like jump off the cliff, right? Or you're like, hey, I feel like I've already committed myself to this process and I'm going to do it. And I think the thing that a lot of entrepreneurs would tell you um, is like, I think you hear, oh, it's difficult and there's so many struggles and everything a lot. But I don't think you actually run those scenarios very honestly with yourself of what it really looks like. So the idea of the chances of success are incredibly low. And you are taking the hardest path you can take in your career for sure. And I mean that um, from a lot of different angles. Like the one that's most obvious is financial stability, where what you need your day to day life to look like for you to maintain your mental health is probably one of the biggest things that no one ever talks about. Where it's like, cool, so you're going to go take a minimal salary. That's the expectation. And you go, well, I could probably live off my savings for, the next 15 months or something like that, or maybe a lot less, like if you're really honest with yourself of what you need to survive. And I think we're all a product of like the last generation being like, oh, work hard and put away 10% and, then you'll be able to buy a house. And I was like, that's all complete garbage now. It does not make any sense at all. And we live in a world that it's very, very expensive and we all don't make enough anyway. So for you to go jump into this entrepreneurship, you really have to take a look at yourself and what um, your real needs are and what your safety nets look like. Because there's a pretty good chance what's going to happen is you're going to spend all of your time and money, and it's going to be really hard to build something, to convince other people to jump on with you, try to find the right resources to build the thing that's in your head or your founder's head. Like you kind of plan on a perfect scenario happening, and it's never perfect. There's so many detours that happen, and your plan go, well, oh my God, I didn't plan for all this stuff. What do I do then? And then you're pot committed. And I mean that in so many different ways. You bet on yourself, yes, but also you have all these other parties that have given you money that have expectations that it's like you've traded one boss for another kind of boss. Um, and at least when you work for another company, bosses have to be a little more reasonable with the expectations. But when you sign yourself up as a founder and sell some dream, you really, really have to look at that and go, how do I actually feel? Like somebody is going to be holding me personally accountable for that thing. And how am I going to mentally grapple with that when things are at their hardest? That's, I think, one of the bigger areas that I don't think anybody really discusses.
Yeah, I think like just the weight of expectations, right? And so many people, to your point, I think so many people have some idea of, oh, that must be like when I worked here and I had three people reporting to me and my butt was on the line for this deadline and my boss was down breathing but down my neck, and that's the weight of expectation. It's like, oh no,
No.
no, 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 no. Let me tell you about not taking a salary but having, X number of teammates taking a salary, that what your decisions mean whether or not they can pay their mortgage, right? Like, and regardless of like, there's all sorts of conversations and things that I've had with founders of like, there's only so much of that you can take on yourself realistically, like logically, but emotionally you take it all on yourself regardless, right? So, um, yeah, it's definitely, that is a big piece of the emotional journey. Um,
Yeah, I think expectation management in there is something that I've definitely learned. I think that's probably one of the major reasons my first company didn't work is because for it was me and two of my best friends. We jumped into this, and of course, we didn't know anything, so we were like, yeah, like equal partnership. We're all like equal owners. We didn't really stipulate anything. So when things got hard and we didn't manage each other's expectations until things got really bad. Of course, there was nowhere to go, but not only did it blow up the company, it destroyed two relationships that meant everything to me. And I, even saying that, right? It's like one of these things where you kind of put the blame on that situation, but it's like, no, 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 it was me and my reactions to this thing that just like just with them, same deal, right? Like we all had our part to play in it.
Hmm.
And those expectation management parts where it's like you don't know what your decisions are actually, like I don't think anybody plays that out, right? Where it's like what happens if, you know
Yep.
um and then you arrive there and you're like, oh, that's what happens.
Yes. Now, uh, speaking of co-founders, and in general, the like how you a key way that many founders manage some of those expectations away is they do take on co-founders. Uh, how how did you find the co-founders for your third time around this ship, and how did you think about finding those co-founders, especially in light of having gone through the scenario where the co-founder relationship sort of blew up there at the end of your first venture?
Yeah. So I found I went in again with two co-founders, but I went in with very clear, like I had done this idea for myself for a little while before I went out and officially grabbed my co-founders. So I knew I was going to be the vision holder for what we were going to do. And like everything I try to do, I'm going to try to be humble, and I'm going to try to take opinions from people that I trust a lot, and be open to suggestions. But I really wanted to establish some clear rails for what our roles and responsibilities would be. And at the end of the day, there's like a time to um, challenge each other, but we have to trust that each other is going to be able to make the decision that we're responsible for, and the others have to be able to support that. And it's an agreement we had to make from the beginning. Um, I think when things are easiest, that's when you should come up with all of the rules on how you're going to deal with conflict. And I think you should run scenarios that you think are actually probable. And then you can, off those scenarios, you can have a more robust conversation on like, hey, if we end up here, this is what we will do, right? And I know we'll probably feel differently, but we're having this agreement in this time, and we can reflect back on it. Um, so I went into it with that. Now, the two co-founders that I definitely wanted to work with, one was from a technical and an operations standpoint that I'd worked with for quite a few years recently. And then the other was a great friend. We'd always been trying to work together over a decade ago at Disney. She was just killing it over on Fortnite and ready for a change. And we knew we wanted to do something. So those were my two co-founders that I went in with. Um, Unfortunately, we did hit a, a pretty early bump in the road with one of my co-founders, and um, I just realized that it was going down a direction where we just weren't on the same page, and the communication wasn't there. I felt like I wasn't able. I was definitely um, feeling like I had to edit what I wanted to do as a result of this. And when I looked at it, again, Carl, you probably picked this up from me I'm very product oriented. So I'm
Hmm.
like, whatever, like, I think my job is to make sure that we deliver the best product possible. That's my job. And I felt like I wasn't able to get there under the current agreement. So before things got too deep in, we had a deep talk, and we decided to just part ways on it. So I lost one co-founder pretty quickly within the first 6 months of um, founding the company. So there was, but honestly, we're on fine speaking terms. I wish him all the best. He the same with me. He's off on his next adventure with a new company, and I'm sure he's going to kill it. And no harm, no foul. Like it's just a professional decision that needed to be executed on. And I feel like I still love him to death. I think the world of him, and I think he's brilliant. So that one, I feel like I really did learn from my first company, and I built something a better structure to be able to handle dispute like that. But my other co-founder, she's still awesome. We're as thick as thieves. We're constantly on the phone chatting and just dealing with everything. Like we deal with everything just arm in arm, lockstep on everything. So that one has been very strong right from the get go.
Yeah. When you think about like those lessons and those structured conversations, like you said, like at the beginning when it's easy, let's have all these conversations up front. Could you take us through a little bit of like a little bit deeper on like what are those conversations? How did you structure them? How did you come to the table? And actually, before I get to that, were either of your other two co-founders there at the beginning second time founders, or were they first time founders?
Yeah, like the one that we ended up walking apart. He's also a multi time founder and quite successful. So I mean, this is his second, but I think his first lasted a decade. So I mean, it was a long lasting company. He was clearly able to execute well, and I think he's one of those. Like he's not a very loud, like in your face will brag about all of his accomplishments, but his accomplishments are incredible. And I knew he knew what he was getting into. So that was an easier conversation. My other co-founder, this is the first time she's ever done anything like this. Um, but that's kind of her jam anyway, right? Is like, my God, she's really incredible with like taking on things that she's never done before and just like seeking out that growth. And she's like, this is where I want to go figure out how I'm going to manage these waters. And um, she just moves through things so quickly like that.
Yeah. So as you're going through this, right? Like you and one of your co-founders have sort of been through the founding trenches and sort of uh, between your two experiences have seen the good, the bad, the ugly, all the way around. The third co-founder, she's coming in with very eager and very interested and willing to learn and willing to jump into it, but not necessarily with the same experience. So what guided conversations and structured conversations did you sit down and be like, let's talk through, like when you say like we talk through all the scenarios, like can you give us a taste of like what are those exactly that you, and how did you have that conversation with them?
Yeah. So one of the first things I did was I very clearly articulated what went wrong in my previous companies and my role that I thought I played in it. And I really try like if you're gonna go into and you know this, if you're gonna go to the trenches with these people, you have to be really vulnerable and honest. And they're going to like if you don't know these people really well, they're gonna get to know you really well, really fast. So
Mm-hmm.
I mean, starting off from an honest standpoint where you're like, all right, so this is what happened with my first company, and this is how it fell apart. So here's some stuff that I think we should do so that doesn't happen here. So one of the things like with my first company is we ended up with a game that was actually incredibly successful very quickly. We did an Angry Birds style game just as Angry Birds came out. We had a publisher that was kind of hungry to support us. We got like 1.3 million downloads in the first like week and a half, and this is early iPhone times. So those were really good numbers, but it wasn't monetizing at all.
Mm-hmm.
And our game just was not good enough. It was not fun in the way it should have been and required a lot of like, we didn't like I tried to pretend to be a game designer and I was not. Our level design was garbage. Like we made a pretty game um, that like we were able to market well, but it didn't
Mm-hmm.
retain very well and it didn't monetize, and that caused a lot of strain in the company's direction. And once you put it under strain, it was like, what a great problem to have, right? Like, oh, what are we going to do with this product? But it turned out very quickly that we had burned each other all out trying to get to that finish line. We did it on almost no money and we were out of runway completely because it was all bootstrapped on like we had no right to do what we did. It was I think I had $5,000 in my bank account, plus a bunch of credit card debt, and I was like, I jumped from a solid job at Ubisoft to go do this thing. Like it was like I had no business doing this thing, but we believed in the opportunity and we believed in each other. But that stress, by the time we hit that decision making period, there was no one. Everybody kind of thought of themselves as the CEO, and nobody really wanted to follow anyone else's direction. Although we were all good friends, we all had very different perspectives on what the company should do. And I realized at the time, I was like, oh no, I want to build like a big game company. And these guys want to build like different variations of an indie thing. And all of us had different, like very different ideas of what we should do next. And then it ended up devolving into some fights that made it worse. Some allegiances with certain advisors were taken, and it got worse. And there was just more and more distance. And by the time we were like, "Hey, we have to have like a decision here, or we're going away," and there was just like, I'd rather see it die than any one of us take it. And we just watched a game that was like could have been a huge success, just die in the vine. And we're like, wow, what a terrible way to watch that happen. And I regret it, but it's like it's also one of those huge learnings that I don't think you could have got any other way. So I guess long way to answer your question. I think I literally walk through scenarios that I'm afraid of. That I'm like, hey, what happens if this? Like, how do you envision yourself in this situation? And how do we like give enough room? Are we on the same page for what we want this company to be? This is what I see the future of it being. And if you're not on the same page with that, that's fine. But now is the perfect time to discuss that. And I think the co-founders conversation that like I see people doing now, right? Where you go and like, hey, I'm thinking of doing something. You're somebody that I thought of that could do this. Here's a vision I have for a thing. Or maybe it's even looser than that, where it's like, I'd like to do something. I don't know quite what it is yet, but I know you're somebody I'd like to work with on it. I think you do end up at some healthier conversations. But I think in that brainstorm mode, especially with unfortunately a lot of the people that end up on our journey do it from um, times of incredible stress that they're just leaving. So it's either like they were just let go out of a job and they're like, screw all these big corporations, I'm going to go do this on my own. Or you're like, hey, I'm in this crazy crunch mode of a company that I'm like, I just got to get out of and I want to go work for myself for a while. And you're just like, I'm just going to go try to build something on my side, and you don't actually realize how burned out you are until like you look back 6 months and you really haven't accomplished anything and you're having trouble getting out of bed. It's like, oh wow, you didn't need to start a company, you needed to take time off, right? I think there's just a lot of those conversations that I see other people having in more constructive ways that I know I missed, that I was like, oh wow, that would have been a great way to start off. But we just kind of, a few of us looked at an opportunity. We were like burning ourselves out on a project at the time at our company that we were employed at, and then we were like, hey, maybe we should do something together instead. Yeah, let's just start working. What if we did this? And it was like before we knew we had a prototype, and then we were like, oh, I wonder if we could just, it's like, oh man, you just one foot in front of the other until you ended up at crazy crossroad that nobody planned for.
Especially in startup lands, it's so interesting. In so many of the stories I hear, both good and bad, and really conflict in how things get made. It's crazy how real the concepts of momentum and inertia are, right? Like
Hmm.
in working and team working stuff. And if you don't if you don't have the conversations, if you don't think things through until they're upon you, by that point, like the momentum or the inertia will stop you in its tracks. And like it's really hard to overcome that once things are moving. And so
I agree.
before anything's really been built up, right? Like
Yeah.
when you're just getting started, trying to have as many of those conversations in a very real way, right? Like I think the thing that you said that I really appreciated was I went through scenarios that I was afraid of, right? Because I think there's lots of people who'll be like, well, let's think about this imaginary scenario and think about this scenario. And it's certainly like if you read a bunch of the Silicon Valley founder stuff, it's like, talk about what an exit would look like and what exits you're okay with and stuff. And it's like, this is games. Like the chances of you having an exit are minimal. So like, what are you going to do when you can't get the go to market to work? What are you going to do when your lead engineer quits? Or like, any of these things, and going through those very real scenarios that have that personal fear of, is so much more powerful as an alignment mechanism with co-founders.
Yeah, I think that's the trap of a lot of this stuff, right? Is like, and they talk about unfair advantages. How many unfair advantages do you have as, a founder and everything? It's like, well, I have this great relationship and this thing. And it's like, oh man, that starts you off so much further ahead. And I do not want to discount any of that stuff because, oh my God, like that's a lot of the moonshots are because somebody was just really close to this thing and kind of understood and just needed this 10% nudge over here, and then boom, wow, they were there. But it's so funny, there's so many of those conversations that I hear, like people listening to founders are equivalent to somebody that was like, hey, I won the lottery, and here's what I did the whole day before I won the lottery. So if you can just duplicate these things, I went and put on a green sweater, and then
Hmm.
I only made right hand turns all the way to my local convenience store. Do these things, and then you can win the lottery too. It's like those things had nothing to do with your success at all. Like, but I mean, more to say that I think the stuff that's more important to focus on, right, is the realities of the situation in front of you. And like to your point of like a lot of these things aren't successful, right? So it's like what are the more realistic ways this thing could fail, and how are we going to react to it? Because I'd say the one thing that I keep finding in every founder I ever talk to is resilience. I'm like, the people that, and that doesn't mean, like, oh, this was a failure and I stuck it out for 10 years. I don't get, that's not resilience. That's something completely different. But resilience is being able to be like hit with problems and not letting it totally defeat you in your vision. And you go, okay, I did not plan for that. How am I going to react to the situation? And what tools do I have within me to show that resilience? Because like that's actually more important than everything else.
If we jump back for a second, because I have a feeling resilience is going to come up here in a second. But if we jump back to a bit, you mentioned that one of the big things that you went on a journey of learning and discovery for this time around was learning how to speak to VCs. I imagine that means that you pursued VCs for the bulk of your funding. And so, to start us off talking about that whole journey, could you tell us a bit about how you're funded in whatever detail you feel comfortable sharing?
Sure, yeah, yeah, absolutely. I definitely wanted to go down the VC route, um, uh, for a multitude of reasons. One, I wanted to make sure that we were building something the scale that I seen possible. Um, and the VC route, there's just a lot of potential to make a really big business, if we went, and like VC cash is very good at putting fuel on a fire that is, going to burn big, and it accelerates everything, right? Like it just, the bootstrap stage, that it's like, hey, I'm going to take 2 years with me and a buddy sitting in a room to kind of slowly prototype this thing. If you already know what good looks like and you're just trying to like very quickly get to market to capitalize on an opportunity, this is where VC cash is awesome. So this is where my opportunity, I'm like, oh wow, I see a really, really big hole in a market right now, and I know why. It's not an ignorant vision. Um, I understand where the market is at, and I know what the next 10 years looks like in it, and I know how my thing is going to fit into it in a meaningful way. So I knew I was going to be able to articulate that. So the VC pitch made the most sense for me. Um, Plus, the difference between like VCs and publishers, right? Like a lot of game publishers look at game ideas constantly, and they're much more, um, I will say, used to looking at go to market strategies, current market focus, really like finger on the pulse for exactly how this thing could happen, but a lot more risk adverse, a lot more risk adverse. If you want somebody that's going to jump onto a vision and take a real gamble on something that could be completely wrong but might be majorly right, VCs are where you want to go. So I knew that's the pitch that I was going to make. So VC cash is where I went. Now, I started out trying, I was like, listen, I don't want to raise very much. I just want to raise enough that, like, me and a couple of buddies that I knew were going to jump into this were going to have enough to just barely kind of squeak by, and um, maybe like have some, like, where all my money was pretty much going was going to be like outsourced cash, so I could kind of quickly get a bunch of content and make it look really pretty and all the things like that. But I ended up being told that I wasn't raising enough um, for it to be interesting. So it was too small. So this was something that I discovered very, very quickly. So I was like, okay, so the comfortable spot for, an early kind of seed company. And keep in mind, I didn't even have a demo. There was no product. I was selling a PowerPoint
Yeah,
and
a deck and a
a dream.
dream, as
Yes.
my lawyers said.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, and I was originally looking for 2.6 million. Um, Ended up raising 4.5, which was great. It gave me, a couple of years worth of runway at the team size that I wanted, and I was like, okay, this is healthy and cool. But I didn't want a very complex cap table. I didn't want to get buried under like too too much of the corporate weight, as we were just trying to figure out where our time and effort was really going to be spent. Um, so I guess I took a lead. I got a couple of lead offers. They were both very cool, but it was a really rough time to raise. Um, I would have raised like just about a year ago, so just beginning of 2024. It was not a wonderful time for valuations of game companies with the VC world. So of course we ended up compromising in ways that we were like, okay, it like didn't get as strong a valuation as I wanted, but at the same time, I knew I wanted to work with people, good people that like one of the things that you've got to be really aware of when working with VCs is these people are going to be a real part of your life for a while, and if you're not on the same page, if you don't click, um, you're signing up for something very uncomfortable for a long time. So I wanted to make sure that I'm like meaningful, genuine relationships mean a lot to me. I want to be able to have some real back and forth that makes my life better. I talk about it all the time. I need more tailwinds, not headwinds. So that was the thing that meant the most to me. So I was able to find a couple of leads that kind of fit that bill, which I was very fortunate. I'm so thankful I did. And I had to choose which one was going to be my lead. So I did, and I made a really good decision. So Convoy is my lead investor out of Denver, and like Josh and Danny and that crew over there are like, I love them to death. They are awesome people, and they make my life a lot easier, which is great. I also pulled some other strategic money alongside as well, just people that I knew would be in my corner and willing to offer more than just a check, but they were going to be involved and give me good opinions, and people that I trusted. So I feel like I felt like I took the money from all the right places, and um, although it did mean some hard conversations, and it meant some things that I'm like didn't like. I ended up saying no to some people that um I did feel bad about saying no to, but at the same time I'm like, I made the right decisions. And there was also a couple that didn't I really wanted money from, that it didn't pan out at all, and you're like, well, you can't have it all.
Yep, 100%. You already alluded to some of this, but from the start of sort of like you've read about the VCs, you've talked to your advisor who is from the VC world and gave you a lot of great advice, and you had your big spreadsheet that we all build, whether it's in Sheets or Airtable or Notion or any number of these things. Um, what actually was the biggest differences between how you thought that whole thing would go and how it turned out? And like, what would you like in a way that like what would you highlight for people who are like looking at VC and thinking about what they know of VC and are going down that path? Like when the rubber met the road, what really went totally differently than how you thought it
Um, that's a great question. What did go totally different? And you're talking more from like building that list and pitching the VC
would? Yeah,
community, like,
just the sort of fundraising journey. I mean, you talked about like how you got feedback that you were raising too little, which it for me is wild whiplash because I've never heard of VC saying you're raising too little, but like what about that whole journey? Like you prepped and you thought you knew it, and then you walked into it and you started having these conversations.
oh
You
yeah,
started
okay.
negotiating that stuff. Like what what was like? Oh, this was totally different than I thought it would go.
So great question. And I don't this is an ignorant part on my side, but I walked into it thinking if you were a gaming VC, you knew a lot about game development. And I was very shocked very
Mm-hmm.
quickly. But I'm like, oh my God. You have a lot of people that are in the space that just look at it from a completely different angle. Like, keep in mind, I've been making video games professionally since 2001. So over 20 years now. I started off as an artist in the trenches, doing stuff on a lot of small games. I've worked on so many different platforms. Most of the games nobody's ever heard of, but a couple of games, like, I was lucky enough to work on some really cool stuff, right? And like with some really talented teams. And I learned a lot and I wore a lot of different hats. I've gone all the way from the trenches all the way to executive producers and running studios. And I'm like, man, I've just benefited from so many awesome people helping me and me being super ignorant and learning and just trying to grow and failing and then trying again, and you get all this information. And then so I guess I thought VCs were going to be more like a publisher executive, where it's like you kind of had um your own unique perspective on the market, but it was still grounded in very much like the reality of how games are made and the reality of how to run teams and how to spend your money most cost effectively. And then I seen a bunch of people that I was like, some of the conversations I had with some VCs, and I'm like, oh my God, like, on what they thought the future of gaming would look like. And then they started pointing at some trends they thought they saw. And then they started pointing at some teams that they had recently invested in. And I was like, wow, that's um, incredibly different than anything I was expecting. Because there was some teams, and I was surprised to see it, but when VCs kind of popped up in the game stuff, right? And there's a lot of really great investments that happen, but some of them were like clearly flawed, where it's like massive, like $26 million given to a few founders that have never run a team at scale before. And it's like, hey, I worked on, whatever AAA game that's like massively awesome. Me and my buddy, we're going to leave and we're going to start the next one following right after it. And we're going to change the world of MOBAs forever. And we need, $25 million to do it. And it's like, yeah, here, take it. That sounds great. We would love that. And I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, what's the vision for how you're going to do that? And the biggest part, like, isn't even the idea, right? It's execution is the biggest part of this whole thing. So how are you going to do it, and do you have any sort of track record that proves that you can? And I was shocked um, at the lack of diligence in that area that I was seeing. I think that was one of the biggest, like, oh my God moments that I had.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big things when I've helped other founders, with their pitch deck and they're new to pitching to VCs, right? So much of those, but like exactly sort of how you mentioned previously, like, oh, I think of it like pitching to an executive who we can all have opinions about all the various executives we worked at all these companies, but they were still more game developer than any of these VC are. And that's not like a dig, it's just a difference
No,
of view and a difference of
that's right.
perspective and what they're looking for and what they're going to ask. And so you would look at these decks where they're going into all this nuance and stuff, and it's like the people you're talking to is not going to care about any of that because they don't understand it, right? They're interested in how you're going to be a 10 times opportunity. What's the vision? How are you going to get
That's
there? All
right.
this kind of stuff.
That's right.
And they're not going to care about the things that you think that they care about. And so, like, helping them calibrate to that is always a big part of the conversation. And I think, to your point, right, like that system has flaws that I think we as game developers see, and at the same time they are the customers that we have to go and talk to, and the or the stakeholders, or however you want to frame it. They're the
Yeah.
walking
Yeah.
bags of money that you have to convince to give you some of it. um and it's definitely a very big perspective shift that I don't know how many people make. um what was the, like, I think, we sort of covered how that journey went and some of the trials and tribulations there, and definitely some of the surprise of, like, what was different than you expected. But for you personally, right, like you're going out, you're doing all these pitches, you're having these conversations. What was the hardest part of that journey for you?
I think as um, I've gotten older, I've realized, I think this is not unique to me. I think this is just what people do, is you realize that um, you become more okay with your personal, strengths and weaknesses. And I think when I started pitching this whole thing, I think I have a tendency to be too honest, um, without like, because they say the real thing with VC pitching, right, is selling the dream. You got to sell the top line of this whole thing of what it could do. Do you believe that that's the likely outcome? Probably not. And that's the thing. And I think as you get older, you get more uh, aware, because you have more rubber on the road, where you're like, hey, there's a lot of things that could happen to this. This is not only a hit driven industry, but there's a lot of things that can kind of come on and interrupt this thing. And here's so I guess when I started pitching and I got this, like, told that I should remove it immediately, I started running like um, biggest best kind of scenarios in my deck. And they were like, remove, remove, don't talk about bigger, biggest, like, or bigger, like, it's just talk about biggest. That's all. And I'm like, oh, like, I just want to be on the same page with, like, I think there's loads of success that could be had in here. And I would love to have a real conversation with real people about it. And like, yeah, no one's going to do it. And you're like, oh, interesting. So just selling the biggest possibility is an interesting thing. And of course, like, I say that, and I'm like, well, I wouldn't. I One of the things that I wanted to know was, like, who are the people, like, not just the the funds that I'm taking money from, but is there any, like, like, LP information? Like, can I understand? I would like to know a little bit more about the money that who's actually invested in me, and that grounds me quite a bit, because I actually feel quite a deal of responsibility to everybody that's taking a leap on me. Not only my employees, but I'm like, this is somebody's hard earned money. And I don't care how wealthy somebody is, that's hard earned money, and that's not mine. And I would like to be real with it. And there's a time and a place to be very real. And then there's a time to sell a vision. And I think I needed a quick reminder at the beginning that it was like, yeah, I don't think I'll ever lose sight of reality because of who I am naturally. But it's also not what's most important here. We've got to go zero in on how big this thing could possibly be. I have to get somebody super excited for this thing, and I have to show them that I'm committed to making that version of this thing happen. They don't want or need in this conversation to hear my backup plans or how I see success in other areas. It's just not helpful. Although I thought I was being helpful.
Yeah. I definitely, I similarly, I think, suffer from a level of my co-founders call it I'm very authentic.
Yeah. Yeah. There you go.
So I am perhaps too authentic occasionally for being a great salesman, um, and understanding the tone and tenor of those conversations and being sort of okay with it and understanding why it's okay and how that's a thing is definitely an emotional journey that I think a lot of people who interact with VC world have to go through, and understanding also that like the conversations you have in the pitch and due diligence are very different than the conversations you have with the board and the people who have put money in. And you're going to have those conversations. It's just not right now, right?
Yes.
Like, and
That's
so
exactly.
finding the
Well
space
said.
for it.
You said it in fewer words. Very well.
Yeah. So that was the sort of the hard part for you during fundraising. But if we back up to thinking about your overall founding journey this time, right? I'm curious, what do you feel like on this third go of it, what is still your biggest struggle, or what is now your biggest struggle in this time as a founder? And how have you been approaching supporting yourself through that struggle?
Oh man, what a great question, Carl. um, I think I went into this a lot more eyes open and in a lot better place for myself, not only like professional skill wise, but like emotional health, like all of the like I just like say whatever you want about EA. EA treated me incredibly well. I had a blast there. I met some incredible friends and we had so much fun building what we built, and it was hard and we were miserable sometimes, but like I think I'll tell those stories forever. So when I was jumping off of this, I had so much passion and enthusiasm for what I wanted to do, and I'm just so excited to do the next thing. And I finally got some time to kind of like really recharge. The thing I did before I started this whole thing is I gave myself essentially a month to play Zelda Tears of the Kingdom professionally. And I mean professionally, like I woke up every morning and I went and sat down and played
Clocked in.
Zelda until lunch, took my
Perfect.
lunch break, then came back
Perfect.
and played Zelda. And I just
Excellent.
did that every day for like a month. And then I was like, wow, I'm just excited to go do my next thing. And I had to like stop myself from starting too early because I was like, no, not yet, give yourself a little bit more time. I just felt like it was the perfect time for me to try this again, and I was going to give myself some grace this time and not um like because I've tended to like beat myself up on a bunch of what I thought was missteps, or like I messed this up. If I would have just blah blah blah, maybe things would be different. And I was going to give myself more grace on it and everything. So I felt like I started off really good. Um, I had an incredible first year of this with the team that I built. There were some really hard decisions in it, and there were some like moments that have not been fun. And we went into early access in September, and then really it's been hard to like navigate this world of like trying to build that audience and try to balance like that go to market strategy with paying for development and all of the challenges and everything. But I'm like, the job that I do today is my favorite job I've ever had. And I get to go, focus on like for years I was like a producer or I was like a creative. I both were so impossible to mix, and this is the first time in years that I was able to just go, cool. I am This job is built around me and what I can offer it. So it's so great. I'm having so much fun, but incredibly high stress, I will say, just because of what we talked about at the beginning, expectation management, where you go the expectations to, I think what you said at the beginning of this of like, oh, you think because I had 3 reports and my boss was breathing down my neck and we had a release coming up and I'm like burning the midnight oil, and you think it's like that stress. It's like, no, 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 it is completely different. Imagine all of that plus you have a board meeting coming up. It's going to be a hard conversation. You're trying to manage those relationships. You're trying to look at runway. You're looking at the next 9 months and going, do I have enough time? How many cracks at this do I have before I'm out of money? And then you look at it and you go, not only is that a thing, but I have like 9 of my friends that are all working with me here. If I have to have that conversation where I have to let go of my friends, what does that look like for me? So it's not only like the stress of like expectations of your job, but it's like, oh my God, I've entangled my personal life into this in a more real way than I ever really anticipated. This time I just feel like I knew that going in and I was able to have more real conversations, but it doesn't make it easy.
Yeah. So when you think about that founding journey and dealing with that stress and navigating it and finding a way to, because like you can be super stressed or burnt out or whatever, but you still have to, especially, and this is part of the stress, in fact, you still have to show up, right? Like if you're the CEO, if you're the leader, you have to show up for anyone else to show up, right? And so how have you what are your sort of like primary support structures for yourself as a founder so that you can be that leader that you need to be?
Yeah, um, I am emotional intelligence means a lot to me. And just like I think we have this world where you have to show up strong and everything like that, and especially in a leadership position, there's all these kind of like um, how what happens when you're not feeling like you and unable. It's like, well, show up and do the thing. It's like showing up is like absolutely the thing for sure because you have to show up in a meaningful way, but this is where I challenge some of this because my co-founder gave me a really nice pat on the back a little while ago for this. I was having a really bad day, and I got into a creative meeting that's really important that I do. Like we have a creative council meeting every week. It's a group of people, and we were trying to solve some big problems. And it's not a short meeting. It's like a 3 hour meeting, and it's first thing on a Wednesday morning. And I walked into it, and they're all waiting, they're all excited, and I'm having a really hard time. So I went through the initial motions of the whole thing, and then I just stopped, and I was like, "Listen, I'm going to be honest with everybody. I'm not in a great mental health space today, and I I can't do this in the way this deserves to be done today. So I'm going to claim a mulligan on this one." And instead of try to force myself through this and not show up as the Steven that I think y'all deserve and I need to be for this meeting, we're just going to cancel this one and we're going to push the agenda next week. And I hope that's okay. Of course, everyone's like, oh my God, yeah, of course, dude, yeah, okay. And my co founder, like, she's like, do you have a minute? And we jumped on afterwards. And she's like, I just wanted to tell you how much I appreciated that. Where if you have that amount of awareness and you can claim that, how much permission that just gave for everyone else um, to take care of themselves in that moment when you're having a really hard time. And I think I brought that story up to a few people. And some of the concerns I get sometimes is like, oh, people are just going to be like peacing out all the time. It's like, no, they really don't. Nobody wants those days. And no one wants to admit those days. But sometimes this is like, it's all just too hard and too much. And I'm like, my job is really, really challenging, and I do have to be at my best. If I'm having a bad day and I just have a bunch of spreadsheets in front of me, and I'm like, I can just like put on some music, have some coffee, and just hammer through it and just deal with my feelings, and I don't have to be like at my peak, then fine. But if I'm running a creative meeting and creativity takes vulnerability and excitement and like it takes an emotional space that you have to like make room for. If you're not there and you can't deliver that, I'm like calling it, I think is really important. Um, and I think that's like something that I grew into, right? Like I know I wouldn't have given myself that amount of grace earlier.
Yeah. And I think, you know, I think that's very important. I think when I think about what leadership should be, especially from, if we're gonna call it, especially from the founding journey, from a CEO seat, where like, yeah, CEOs are meant to be the face of the company in many ways, or the fundraiser and that kind of stuff. But another big role of the CEO and any founder is being the one who sets the tone and tenor and culture of the studio, and not by, as everyone often says, what you put on the walls or what you put in the Notion or whatever, but like how you act, right? And I think that's some of what I mean, right? Is like there's an amount of support that you have to find for yourself of being able to have that awareness and knowing what happens when Stephen is not in the right mental health space, what could go wrong in that moment that would end up being detrimental to the company, be detrimental to the relationships, detrimental to the product, so that you have the awareness to be like, hey, time out. This is how I'm feeling. I'm going to be vulnerable. Let me also model how I want all of us to behave when we're in this space and that kind of thing, and do that choice. And I think to your point, like there is a performative showing up, and then there is the showing up you have to do when you are the steward of the culture, right? Um, and so,
I guess you get to define what showing up means, right? And it's like what that looks like for your company and studio. I think that's really important to define because I think showing up, like we overburden ourselves. We have this like martyr complex, right? Where we're just like, like I worked 90 hours and it's like, oh my God, I can't do another thing, but I'm here because I'm dedicated and blah blah blah. And it's like we have
I'm
this
sleeping on the
thing.
floor.
Exactly, exactly. And dude, I have been there. I've been that person that has done that. And it's like I hear myself doing it and I'm like, ah man, I'm doing it again. And it's like, but I try to approach it with a little healthier of a spot. Although I fail often for sure. But it's one of those things where you catch yourself and you try to do better every time. But showing up, making sure it's, you know, the startup journey is an interesting one because you're kind of signing up to a dream and you're going, hey, we're gonna have to like cut some corners and figure out how to do this. You're all gonna have to wear 9 hats. There's way too much work for all of us. And you go, yeah, like, but it's kind of interesting, especially when you come from a corporate culture where people, the narrative of this like martyrdom kind of thing is like kind of so I can get the next opportunity. And like I see a lot of people being like, yeah, I'm like burning the candle at both ends for this thing, like bonus time, kind of thing. Like it's a very transactional kind of um, thing. When startup, there's nothing to hide behind like that. You're either kind of like in it and committed or you're not. And like the contrast of seeing it is very obvious. There's just nowhere to hide, right? So I guess when I talk about like showing up, it's just like all of that stuff and how you show up is now really important because kind of the stage show of like everything that would exist in the corporate world is all stripped down, and normally the people pretty well that you're in the startup scenario with, so people know like what Carl in a good mood looks like versus miserable, and they know how to kind of navigate that a little bit. And if you haven't a good enough startup culture where your co-founder or even one of your employees or friends can look at you and go, dude, you are not doing great today. Like, how about we call it for you today? And it's like, no, I don't want to. I need to do this thing. And it's like, I know you do, but like, I think we'll get more out of you if you just kind of like take care of yourself for a day. Why don't you just take the afternoon and like take a nap or do something, and then we'll talk about it. It's like if you have that kind of relationship with each other, I guess that's what I mean by showing up in the way
Yeah,
that
100%. Just to dig in for a second, because I am curious about this, and sort of from the view of going back to folks who are on this journey with us, right? Like not directly with us, but like fellow founders on their fellow journeys, navigating this space, who don't necessarily know how to find the ways to get there mentally and emotionally, right? Like especially first time founders, I think they're building their support structures, um, their introspection structures to figure out like how do I know when I'm just not there? How do I show up? Like how do I choose or how do I craft my version of showing up, and how do I craft that culture around me of it? You know, how obviously and for most of us it's a series of like, yep, I kept putting my hand on the stove and then I eventually realized it was hot, and that's how I learned. But like, could you share a little bit of like how you got to this place where you started to internalize, here's what it means for me to be who I need to be when I need to be, and how to make sure that I can be that person, or have the vulnerability or have the space to say, I'm not there, let's move a meeting or let's do something different. um, for folks who are still trying to build that muscle, right? Like, how when you reflect on your journey as a founder and building up the support structures for yourself to be in that right headspace to be the founder you wanted to be, how did you get there?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's like, I don't know if there's anything other than time and experience of like, for me, like how I got here was essentially a lot of looking at my life and the patterns that, like, when I'm at my best, what does that look like? And when I feel like I've contributed in a way that's really authentic to who I am. And I'm like, what did that feel like? And how was that situation manifested in my life? Like, I think you can look at that and go, yeah, like I'm at my best here. And I think a lot of us end up doing this thing, right? Where you're just trying to, like, maybe in your, not to generalize too much, but in your 20s, you're like, hey, here's who I'm trying to be, you know? And then you kind of get a little older and you're like, hey, that's exhausting. Uh, th- this is who I am.
Yeah.
And like, sorry about that. And then you get to the point where you're like, I'm not even sorry anymore. This is just who I am. And I'm not going to put any like, um, because you realize you're like, I only have a set amount of like, I think that's the thing that people don't understand. Like things like patience, things like that's a depletable resource. And I don't think people realize that. You start off every day with a set amount of patience and you can wear out of it really quickly. So if you're driving yourself through a bunch of things that you know are going to wear down that patience, and then you're going to end up at a place where it's like, cool, I have no patience left and I have to go make some big decisions, you are not going to show up as the person you want to show up as. And I think getting more structured, if you have more awareness of who you are and like what good looks like with the version of you, you can start to like plan your days better. Like I noticed I hate Monday. I always have hated Monday. And I'm like, it's not like even the like, oh, the Sunday scaries, I got to go to work. It's not that. It's just like the whole rhythm of entering back into the meeting cycle, and I'm actually not a very extroverted person. I just pretend to be. So it's like actually it's going to start a bunch of things where I need to like go do that all over again. And it's the top of the expectation, right? Where it's like this is the biggest it'll be all week and then it pans down from there. So I always hated Mondays. So I started structuring my Mondays to be more the things that I loved and things that were like going to rejuvenate me. So I'm like, I have my all hands meeting with my team on Monday. First thing, we talk about what we're working on. I say good morning to everybody. I get to see everybody's face. They talk about all the things. I'm like, cool, we're done. Then really, it's a lot more like I get to structure my time and, like look at the game and spend some time figuring out like how I'm feeling about our latest, release. And it's a lot of I get to, put on some music and have a coffee and, do some stuff. And I noticed I'm like, well, Mondays, they're not awesome anymore, but they're a whole lot better. And if I have a great Monday, it usually leads to a really good Tuesday and an even better Wednesday. And then I'm like, Thursdays are my favorite days. They're like so awesome because I always get the most done on Thursdays. I have the most information. I have a few days behind me of getting all the stuff done that had to be done. This is like my day to like capitalize, man. And I'm like, cool. If I know that about myself, I can structure that a little bit more and it just gets more and more refined. I'm like, oh, I just love that.
Yeah. Again, I think momentum and inertia.
Yeah.
They're such real. They're
Yeah.
like really annoyingly real concepts
Yes.
in a lot
Yes.
of
I
ways.
totally agree.
When you think about the next, I don't know, whatever feels an appropriate long term horizon or medium term horizon, let's say, like not necessarily what are you going to do next month, but like What are you thinking about for the rest of 2025? What's really on the horizon, both for yourself as a founder and also the company that you're giving a lot of thought to?
Yeah, I think like we're in a really interesting place where we have a live product and we're focusing on like a go to market strategy and just, but we've very unique audience, right? Like, how do you go build a kids audience when you can't really market to kids under 13? What does that look like? And so I end up in this place where you go, I really feel like our product can make the world a better place. It's just like, my background, like I was lucky enough to work on Club Penguin for multiple years. And I really feel like that helped a generation learn what safe communities online could look like. And I'm like, that's what I'm in this for now, to do this for the next generation, for my kids' generation. And I'm so excited about it. The go to market though is like, this is a really challenging time to release games, like really challenging. I don't think it's ever been harder right now, um, than right now to do that, to build an audience, to go after this. um, so I look at it and I go, okay, so we build scenarios for all of the things and we go, hey, this is what it looks like, here's our approach, let's give ourselves some really clear targets, and then a lot of different potential directions we can go off of wherever we land. So I think one of the things I've learned multiple times is never plan for a best case scenario. Is you always like, there's a million different paths to success. What do we think the most likely outcome is going to be, and how do we build a plan around that? So you're not surprised when you get to anything. You're not overly disappointed with it, with something not working, and that was like your moonshot plan. But for me as a company, I'm like, we're in a really cool place. We're actually seeing some really great traction. We get some really positive signals. So I'm starting to look at the next stage of this company and going, wow, we've got some amazing things in our future, but it probably means this stops being a startup pretty quickly. So you look at scale and you go, okay, so how do you take that next leap? What does it look like? What key positions are you going to hire for? And because some of those positions are so critical, it's probably going to be some long courting conversations with some very specific people. That could be a year of, you know, early conversations and just trying to feel it out and find those people right for that right position. So I mean, that's what my next year looks like. Continue just building market, go to market strategy, all of those things, market fit. I think this is the thing, like I harp with other founders all the time. Finding market fit is your goal. That is what it is. And I'm like, you got to be laser until you understand who your audience is, how to speak to them, and how to get more into your product. Like that is the goal. So we can't lose sight of that. But scale is going to be my next thing. So more leaders, more specialized roles, instead of, we have a lot of us are just generalists that can do a lot of stuff.
Now, perhaps the less unfair question for you, since you have now three under your belt, but given the experience thus far of all three, if you go into some indeterminate time in the future, won't say whether or not this one is a success or failure, who knows? Would you start another one?
Yeah, and here's why. I think when you get into a company, especially in games, what happens is somebody hires you for a very specific role, and then you have to go master that role over time. I think some people um, thrive in that kind of. I know like artists that I started working with when I started in the early 2000s that are still artists and still very happy in their field, and they're still kind of trucking away, and that's all they ever want to do. That wasn't what I wanted. So a very specific role was very limiting to me. Um, and I wanted to be able to grow and stretch and do all of the things. Um, I've learned what parts of my job I'm really good at through entrepreneurship. And I've learned where my value is a lot more. And I've also learned the things that I hate to do a lot more. So I think I find out every time I do this, for one thing, even when it's failure, I'm like we got to get past this. Failure is not failure like you think it is. Um, and it's not as bad as you think it is. I went like I've talked about this a bunch, but it's like those people you went to school with that if they didn't get a 95%, they would just collapse. They'd be so upset. The expectations are so high. It's perfect or nothing. Those are the people that actually have a hard time adapting to things that they can't control, right? Because it's like a lot of this is out of your control. You can try as hard as you can, but I can't go to a judge and say I tried really hard and no one bought my game. Give me $10 million because I think I deserve it. Like that's just not a conversation. Um, it's probably gonna fail, but every single time, every one I've done has led to my next bigger opportunity because I just got better and better at what I did. And then it's like, I think it's the narrative that you tell yourself that is the most important thing. And I'm not saying like build some false narrative that you don't believe and you're going to lie to yourself and like, like it's complete uh, BS. But I mean, like, trust the facts. You got to look at the facts, not the like, what ifs and oh maybe this and oh I think people think this about me and oh blah blah. It's like, dude, you're gonna like make your own narrative. Why not actually like focus on some of the good things that you ended up on the other side? Would it have been great if you built a product and 10 million people showed up and everybody loved it and you were lauded as the best thing and like yeah that would have been awesome, but I mean it's probably not likely, but it doesn't mean you're not awesome at what you do, and what you did wasn't incredible and a huge accomplishment. And I mean, some of the littlest stuff I've ever worked on, I have people walk up to me still today and be like, "You worked on this game," and I was like, "How do you even know that?" Like it's so like like you're one of the 10 people that played it. I guess like it's just
Yeah.
like weird. You never know. Games are a weird thing, man. I think we lose sight of it sometimes because we're game developers and we just like, run each other through the gauntlet sometimes. But I mean, it's a megaphone to the world. You get to say whatever you want, and there's all these people that are going to hear it. And games are very formative, where it's like, I know you're going to do something that somebody picks up and plays, and it is going to be something they look back on forever. And you think, not mine, it's so small, there's nothing meaningful in it. It's like, no, yours too. I once talked to this guy that was making little games, like little match three kind of games way back in the day. And they weren't, crazy robust or anything, but he was having fun making them and he was putting them out. Nobody was really buying them, a few thousand sales ever kind of thing. And somebody reached out to him and was like, "Hey, your Christmas version of this game, I've played every year for the last 5 years, and it just reminds me of my mom. And we used to play, and she's passed away now. And every year I play it around the holidays as part of my routine." And he's just like, "Oh my God, like that's, yeah, it's like, yeah, you become a part of someone's life somewhere. And it's like, that's pretty powerful. And like, not everybody has to, like, you know, be the next major indie hit to call this a success. Like this is this is bigger than that."
Yep. 100%. We've gone a little bit long, so I want to sort of wrap this up. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. Before we sort of wrap things up, do you have anything you want to tell the people out there, show, plug, shout out, any of those sorts of things?
Uh, I won't plug anything. I guess I really think for this audience, right? Like, I know if you're going into this and you're looking at what entrepreneurship could mean for you, or you jumped into it, I hope like it's helpful. And Carl, thanks for building this. I mean, like, I wish I would have known about this and been able to listen to it because there isn't a lot of great resources. And books like Founder versus Investor and things like that are kind of like that actually gave me a really negative take on what it could be. Although it's a well written book, it seems like it was written by people that were really at odds with each other. And I'm like, that's unfortunate because I think you can build a positive relationship. I think it's how you go into the whole thing and how you kind of honor your position. Um, it's just like relationships, right? Like the people that don't like you, don't try to convince them to like you. Find people that like you, and that makes everything easier. So I think it's just that. And lastly, for me, I'm like, just in how we're approaching everything in games right now. I know it's pretty bleak looking and everything, but I'm like, I've been in the industry for a long time. This is bad. It's bad. But it always gets better. People are still very into gaming. The interest hasn't waned. I mean, the industry is trying to sort itself out and things will get stronger, but it's actually a time to be really excited because that this last little while of a hiccup has actually caused tons of people like you and me and everything to come with some pretty radical ideas in this VC world that exists now. If you have a great idea and you want to go change the world through games, now is the perfect time. And I know it might be uncomfortable, but that might be exactly what we all need. So I'd leave it with that.
And if anyone out there heard some of your advice or some of your stories and really wants to follow up with you on anything, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, just email me or add me on LinkedIn. You can find me. But my email, I have a very easy email. It's Steven@magicpotiongames.com. Please just send me a note, and I'll get back to you. I'd love to chat.
Well, thank you again so much for spending time with us. And good luck with the next year of thinking about courting all those folks that you need to hire.
Absolutely. Thanks, Carl. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the entire episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends or anyone you think could benefit from it, and leave us a positive rating or subscribe. This episode was edited by Christopher Delano, music by Jake Hall, who's available for composer work in games. And if you're interested in learning more about the Game Founder support community, go to gamefounders.org or email me at carl@gamefounders.org. Thanks so much.